When a grieving widower discovers a desperate mother and her children seeking shelter in his barn during a fierce Montana blizzard, his lonely world suddenly changes forever. Will he find the courage to open not just his home, but his heart, to give them his name? Thomas Miller's legs burned with each step through the knee-deep snow. The bitter Montana winter of 1885 showed no mercy, even to a man who'd lived here all his life. Wind howled across the empty fields as darkness fell, bringing with it another blast of icy snow that stung his weathered face. His faithful dog Rusty pushed ahead, creating a narrow path for his master to follow. "Almost there, boy," Thomas said, his words vanishing into the howling wind. The barn appeared through the white haze, a dark shadow against the stormy twilight. Thomas leaned into the wind, clutching his coat tighter. 3 years he'd lived alone on this farm since Elizabeth died. 3 years of talking only to animals and the occasional traveler. Some days he went without speaking at all. Rusty reached the barn first, pawing at the door and whining an odd behavior for the normally quiet dog. "What is it?" Thomas asked, quickening his pace despite his aching joints. The barn door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the familiar smell of hay and horses greeting him. But something was different. Rusty darted inside, his tail wagging as he disappeared into the shadows beyond the lantern light. Thomas raised the lantern higher, its glow spreading across the barn floor. His heart nearly stopped when the light fell upon a woman huddled in the hay, 2 small children pressed against her sides. Their faces, smudged with dirt and hollow from hunger, stared back at him with equal parts hope and fear. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled her daughters closer, their thin shoulders covered by what looked like an old tablecloth. "Just one night. We'll leave at first light." Thomas stood frozen in place. It had been so long since he'd had unexpected company, let alone a woman with children seeking shelter in his barn. "How did you get here?" he asked finally, his voice rough from disuse. The woman swallowed hard. "We walked. From Silver Creek." "Silver Creek? That's 20 miles south." Thomas glanced at the children's thin shoes, now soaked through from snow. "The mining company gave us 3 days to leave after my husband died," she explained, her words tumbling out quickly as if afraid he'd send them away before she could finish. "I'm Sarah Bennett. These are my daughters Emma and Jane." The older girl, perhaps 7 years old, lifted her chin slightly at the mention of her name. The younger one, barely more than a toddler, kept her face buried against her mother's side. Outside, the wind shrieked louder, rattling the barn walls. Thomas looked from their frightened faces to the blizzard beyond the door. The nearest town was 15 miles away. They'd never make it, not in this storm, not with 2 small children. "You can't stay here," Thomas said finally. Sarah's face fell, but she nodded, already gathering her few belongings. "I understand. We'll find somewhere else." "No," Thomas clarified, shaking his head. "I mean, you can't stay in the barn. It's too cold out here. You'll need to come to the house." The relief that washed over the woman's face made Thomas look away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wasn't offering charity, just basic human decency. Anyone would do the same, wouldn't they? As he led them across the yard toward his house, Thomas felt something stir inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. 3 years of emptiness had hardened something in his chest, made it difficult to breathe around other people. Now he was bringing strangers into Elizabeth's home. Sarah stumbled in the deep snow, nearly falling before Thomas caught her arm. Her thinness shocked him. He could feel her bones through her coat sleeve. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked. "The children had a little bread yesterday," she answered, avoiding his real question. Inside, the farmhouse was clean but Spartan. Thomas had put away most of Elizabeth's touches, the colorful quilts, the dried flower arrangements, after she died. Now the rooms felt bare, utilitarian. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, gesturing to the hearth where embers still glowed. "I'll get it going again." As he stoked the fire back to life, Thomas became acutely aware of how unused he was to company. His movements felt clumsy, his home suddenly strange with others in it. The girls watched him silently, their eyes huge in their small faces. "I'll make something to eat," he said, moving toward the kitchen where half a pot of stew still sat from his dinner. "Thank you," Sarah said, helping her daughters remove their wet shoes. "We won't be any trouble. I can work, cook, clean, whatever you need in exchange for shelter." Thomas nodded stiffly. Already he was calculating. The storm would likely last 3 days at least. They couldn't travel in this weather. But after that, he hadn't thought beyond tonight. As he reheated the stew, Thomas glanced back at the 3 figures huddled by his fire. The younger girl had fallen asleep against her mother, exhaustion finally winning over hunger and fear. It had been so long since a child slept under this roof. Elizabeth had wanted children desperately. Now strangers occupied the home they'd built together. What would Elizabeth think of this situation? The question came unbidden, surprising him. He hadn't allowed himself to wonder what she would think about anything for a long time. It hurt too much. But tonight, as he carried bowls of hot stew to the hungry family warming by his fire, Thomas couldn't help but feel that somehow, some way, Elizabeth might have had a hand in bringing them here. Sunrise painted the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold, a deceptive beauty that masked the deadly cold. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, cup of coffee warming his hands, watching as the blizzard briefly paused its assault. Rusty lay at his feet, unusually content to remain indoors rather than begin his morning patrol of the property. "Is there always this much snow?" a small voice asked. Thomas turned to find Emma, the older girl, standing in the doorway. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that seemed too serious for a child. "Not always," he answered. "This winter's been harder than most." The girl nodded as if his answer confirmed some private theory. "That's why Mama couldn't find work in Silver Creek. Everyone kept saying, 'Come back in spring.'" A pang of something pity, perhaps, struck Thomas unexpectedly. He wasn't used to children and their blunt observations. Spring feels far away, but it always comes eventually. Sarah appeared behind her daughter, looking slightly better after a night's rest. "Emma, don't bother Mr. Miller with questions." "She's no bother," Thomas replied automatically, though socializing did feel like a long-forgotten skill he was struggling to remember. "There's coffee if you'd like some." The storm returned with new fury by mid-morning, trapping them all indoors. Thomas retreated to his workshop attached to the house, seeking refuge in the familiar. His hands found comfort in the routine of sanding wood, creating something tangible when everything else felt uncertain. The half-finished rocking chair had been sitting untouched for months, a project he'd started and abandoned when memories of Elizabeth became too sharp. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, little Jane balanced on her hip. "I hope we're not disturbing you," she said. "But Jane noticed your tools and—" She trailed off, gesturing to the child's wide-eyed fascination with the woodworking implements. Thomas set down his sandpaper. "My father was a carpenter. Taught me everything he knew." "You're very skilled," Sarah observed, running her free hand along the smooth curve of the unfinished rocking chair. "These dovetail joints are perfect." Surprise registered on Thomas's face. "You know woodworking?" A small smile touched Sarah's lips. "My father was a furniture maker in Pennsylvania before we moved west. I spent my childhood surrounded by sawdust and wood shavings." For the first time, Thomas really looked at her. Sarah Bennett was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that might once have been pretty before hardship etched its lines. But her eyes held intelligence and something else, a stubborn resilience that hadn't yet been broken. "What brought you to Montana Territory?" he asked, curiosity overcoming his usual reticence. "Dreams of silver," she answered with a tired laugh. "James, my husband, heard there was good money in the mines. We came out 3 years ago with such high hopes." Little Jane squirmed to get down, and Sarah set her carefully on the floor, watching as the child toddled toward a small wooden horse Thomas had carved months ago and forgotten. "She can play with it if she likes," Thomas offered. Sarah nodded gratefully. James died in a tunnel collapse 8 weeks ago. The company gave us his last wages, minus what they claimed we owed for rent and store credit. It wasn't enough to get back east. The matter-of-fact way she delivered this tragic news caught Thomas off guard. No tears, no dramatic sighs, just the plain truth of her situation, stated with the same tone someone might use to describe bad weather. "I'm sorry," he said inadequately. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I lost my wife 3 years back. Fever took her before the doctor even reached our farm." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss as well." It wasn't much, this exchange of sympathies, but it created something between them, a fragile bridge of shared understanding. The rest of the day passed in a strange domestic rhythm that felt both foreign and vaguely familiar to Thomas. Sarah insisted on cooking, producing a surprisingly flavorful stew from his limited pantry supplies. The girls gradually lost their wariness, Emma even asking Thomas questions about the farm animals while Jane followed Rusty around with solemn devotion. By evening, Thomas found himself sitting in his usual chair by the fire, but instead of silence, the room was filled with the soft sounds of others. Sarah's needle pulling thread through fabric as she mended Emma's dress. The girls whispered conversation as they played with the wooden animals Thomas had given them. "The storm's likely to last another few days," he said suddenly. "You're welcome to stay until it passes." Sarah looked up from her mending. "That's very kind, but we've imposed enough." "It's no imposition," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the truth of those words. "Where will you go when it clears?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah's hands stilled, her expression troubled. "I have a distant cousin in Helena," she finally answered. "I wrote to her after James died, but never received a reply. I'm not sure she's still there, but it's the only connection we have left." Thomas nodded, calculating the distance in his head. Helena's nearly 100 miles northwest. Not an easy journey in winter, especially on foot. "We don't have many options, Mr. Miller." Sarah's voice held that same matter-of-fact tone that conveyed volumes about her situation without asking for pity. "Thomas," he corrected her. "If you're staying under my roof, you might as well use my name." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Thomas, then." That night, as Thomas lay in his bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of others breathing in his home, he wondered what tomorrow would bring. 3 years of solitude had created deep grooves in his life, patterns he followed without thought. These strangers had disrupted everything. Yet somehow, despite the inconvenience and awkwardness, Thomas couldn't bring himself to wish them gone. The house felt different tonight, warmer somehow, as if it had remembered its purpose after years of neglect. Outside, the blizzard raged on, sealing them together in this unexpected arrangement for at least a little while longer. Thomas couldn't help wondering if this storm was merely a pause in their separate journeys, or the beginning of something none of them could yet imagine. 3 days passed, and still the snow fell. Nature had transformed the world outside into a white prison, beautiful but treacherous. Inside Thomas Miller's farmhouse, something else was changing too. Something harder to name but just as profound. "Your cow's going to calve soon," Sarah said, returning from the morning chores Thomas had reluctantly allowed her to share. She stamped snow from her boots at the kitchen door, her cheeks flushed from cold and exertion. Thomas looked up from the breakfast dishes he was drying. "How can you tell?" "The way she's standing, shifting her weight. My father kept dairy cows back in Pennsylvania. I'd guess within the next 2 days." Thomas nodded, impressed despite himself. He'd noticed the signs too, but many city folk wouldn't recognize them. "You have a good eye." Emma burst into the kitchen, her previous shyness dissolving more each day. "Mr. Thomas, Rusty found something in the snow. Something alive." Thomas followed the excited child to the front porch where Rusty stood guard over a small, shivering rabbit, its leg clearly injured. "Poor thing," Emma whispered, kneeling beside the animal. "Can we help it?" Thomas hesitated. In normal circumstances, he might have quickly ended the creature's suffering. But Emma's hopeful face made him reconsider. "We can try," he said finally. "Get a box from the storeroom." Emma raced off, delighted with her mission. Behind Thomas, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "She's always had a soft heart for wounded things," Sarah said quietly. "James used to say she'd bring home every stray in Silver Creek if we let her." Thomas felt a strange twist in his chest at the mention of James Bennett. He'd thought about the man occasionally over the past days, wondering what kind of husband and father he'd been, whether he'd appreciated what he had before the mine took him. Little Jane toddled onto the porch, clutching her wooden horse. At just 4 years old, she spoke less than Emma but observed everything with solemn brown eyes. She pointed at the rabbit with concern. "Hurt," she stated simply. "Yes," Thomas agreed, crouching to her level. "But we're going to try to make it better." The child studied him thoughtfully, then nodded as if he'd passed some important test. By mid-afternoon, the rabbit was resting in a makeshift bed of straw in the kitchen, its injured leg splinted with small pieces of wood and cloth strips. Emma had appointed herself nurse, checking on the patient every few minutes. "What will we name him?" she asked, gently stroking the rabbit's soft fur. "Emma," Sarah cautioned, "don't get too attached. Wild animals often don't survive captivity." Thomas saw the girl's face fall. "But sometimes they do," he added. "I once nursed a fox kit back to health. Lived in the barn for months before heading back to the wild." Emma brightened. "Really? What was his name?" "Didn't have one," Thomas admitted. "Never thought to name him." "Everything needs a name," Emma insisted. "It's how you know you belong somewhere." The simple wisdom in her words hung in the air. Thomas caught Sarah's gaze across the kitchen, saw something like pain flash across her face before she turned away. That evening, Thomas retreated to his workshop while Sarah put the girls to bed. The half-finished rocking chair sat in the center of the room, a project he'd started for Elizabeth but never completed. His fingers traced the smooth curves of the wood, remembering how she'd asked for a chair where she could sit and hold their future children. Children who never came. The sound of footsteps pulled him from these thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, a mug of coffee in each hand. "I thought you might like some," she said, offering him one. "The girls are finally asleep." Thomas accepted the mug with a nod of thanks. Sarah didn't leave immediately as he expected. Instead, she wandered around his workshop, examining the tools hung neatly on the wall, the pieces of furniture in various stages of completion. "This is beautiful work," she said, running her hand along the spindles of the rocking chair. "Your wife must have loved the things you made for her." "She never saw this one," Thomas admitted. "I started it when we thought she might be expecting. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to finish it." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "James carved toys for the girls. Nothing as fine as your work, but they treasured them. Emma kept a little wooden bird he made until it was lost when we had to leave our company house." The mention of their departure brought a shadow to Sarah's face. "The storm seems to be letting up," she observed, looking toward the small workshop window. "Probably clear by tomorrow." Thomas felt an unexpected pang at her words. "No need to rush off. The roads won't be passable for days yet. We've imposed on your kindness long enough." Sarah's voice was firm but gentle. "Once the weather breaks, we should continue to Helena." Thomas found himself searching for arguments against their departure. "It's nearly 100 miles in deep snow. You have no money, no transportation." "We've managed before," Sarah replied, though her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. "At least wait until spring," Thomas suggested, the words tumbling out before he could consider them fully. "When the passes are clear and travel is safer. You could stay on as housekeeper if you want. I could pay a small wage." Sarah studied him, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Why would you do that? You don't know us." Thomas had no ready answer. He couldn't explain the emptiness that awaited him after their departure, couldn't put into words how the house had begun to feel like a home again with their presence. "It's practical," he said finally. "You need a safe place until better weather. I could use help with the farm." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough of it that Sarah didn't immediately refuse. Instead, She nodded thoughtfully. I'll consider it. Thank you. Later that night, Thomas lay awake listening to the wind dying down outside his window. The storm was indeed breaking. Tomorrow would bring clear skies and decisions that couldn't be avoided. The thought of returning to his solitary existence made something ache deep in his chest, a feeling he'd nearly forgotten was possible. In the guest room across the hall, Sarah Bennett also lay awake, running calculations in her head. The money James's mining company had given her was long gone. The journey to Helena was risky at best, deadly at worst, especially with 2 young children in winter. And her cousin, a woman she barely knew, might not welcome 3 unexpected dependents. Thomas Miller's offer made practical sense. Yet Sarah sensed something beneath his gruff exterior that both drew her and made her cautious. She recognized the look of loneliness in his eyes, understood it intimately. But she couldn't afford to make decisions based on emotions, not with her daughter's welfare at stake. Morning brought sunshine sparkling across unblemished snow and the distant sound of a cow in distress. Thomas was already pulling on his boots when Sarah appeared in the kitchen. "The calf's coming," she said unnecessarily, reaching for her coat. Together they trudged through knee-deep snow to the barn where the cow lowed miserably, sides heaving with contractions. "I'll get fresh straw," Sarah offered, moving efficiently toward the storage area. For the next hour, they worked together without needing many words, anticipating each other's movements as if they'd done this many times before. When complications arose, the calf presenting backward, Thomas was grateful for Sarah's smaller hands and surprising strength. Finally, a wet, gangly calf slid into the world, its mother immediately beginning to clean it with rough licks. "A heifer," Thomas said, pleased. "Good stock too." Sarah smiled, her face flushed with exertion and satisfaction. Straw clung to her hair and clothes, and Thomas was struck by how different she looked from the desperate woman he'd found in his barn just days ago. "Life goes on," she said softly, watching the new calf struggle to stand on wobbly legs. "No matter what." Thomas nodded, unable to find words for the moment. Instead, he simply stood beside her, watching new life find its footing in his barn on a brilliant winter morning, sensing that something equally new and fragile was finding its way into his heart. Emma's delighted gasp announced the arrival of the girls, bundled against the cold but eager to see the new calf. "Can I name her?" Emma asked, eyes wide with wonder. Thomas glanced at Sarah, who gave a small nod of permission. "Yes," he told Emma. "She needs a name to know where she belongs." The first trip into town happened on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the storm broke. The Bennett family had stayed, their presence transforming Thomas's quiet farmhouse in ways both subtle and profound. Sarah's practical decision to remain until spring had come with clear terms. She would earn her keep through housekeeping and help with farm chores, teaching the girls to contribute according to their abilities. Thomas hitched the horses to the sleigh, packing it with empty feed sacks and a list of supplies they needed from Riverspend. Sarah wrapped the girls in every available blanket, their excited faces barely visible beneath woolen scarves. "First time in a sleigh," Emma explained, her words forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Mama, will there be other children in town?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair. "Perhaps, but remember what we discussed. We'll be quick about our business and return before dark." Thomas helped them onto the wooden bench, noticing how Sarah's hands trembled slightly despite her confident expression. He understood her anxiety. After weeks of isolation on the farm, the prospect of facing strangers raised complicated questions about their unusual living arrangement. The sleigh glided smoothly over packed snow, bells jingling a cheerful rhythm that matched Emma's chattering excitement. Jane sat quietly between her mother and sister, one mittened hand occasionally reaching to touch the wooden horse Thomas had carved for her, now a constant companion. "Riverspend isn't much," Thomas warned as they crested the final hill. "One main street, general store, church, post office. Sheriff Davis keeps order, though trouble's rare except when miners come through with full pockets." Sarah nodded, straightening her threadbare coat. "It sounds like Silver Creek, only smaller." The sleigh's arrival on Riverspend's main street drew immediate attention. Thomas felt the weight of curious stares as he helped Sarah and the girls down, whispering quick introductions to Mr. Jenkins, who ran the general store. "Miller, thought you might have been buried under all that snow," Jenkins called heartily, eyeing the unfamiliar woman and children with undisguised curiosity. "Been months since you've come to town." "Been busy," Thomas replied shortly, helping Jane navigate the store's threshold. Inside, warmth and the mingled smells of coffee, leather, and spices enveloped them. Emma gazed wide-eyed at shelves stocked with goods she hadn't seen since leaving Silver Creek. Colorful candies in glass jars, bolts of fabric, shiny tools hanging from ceiling hooks. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Jenkins greeted from behind the counter, her smile freezing slightly as she noticed the Bennett family. "And who might these folks be?" Before Thomas could answer, the store door opened again, admitting Reverend Hollis, whose eyebrows rose dramatically at the scene before him. "Thomas Miller, what a pleasant surprise," the minister said, removing his hat. His gaze traveled slowly from Sarah to the girls, then back to Thomas with unspoken questions. "Reverend," Thomas nodded curtly. "May I introduce Mrs. Sarah Bennett and her daughters, Emma and Jane. They're staying at my farm until spring makes travel safer." "I see," Reverend Hollis replied, though his expression suggested he saw rather more than Thomas had explained. "Mrs. Bennett, a pleasure. What brings you to our little community?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Circumstance, Reverend. My husband died in the Silver Creek mine collapse. Mr. Miller kindly offered shelter when we had nowhere else to go." Her dignified response seemed to satisfy the minister temporarily, though Thomas noticed how Mrs. Jenkins leaned closer, hungry for details. "Such Christian charity," Reverend Hollis commented. "Though I must say, Thomas, proper appearances are important even in acts of kindness. Perhaps Mrs. Bennett would be more appropriately situated in town, where the Ladies' Aid Society could assist her." Thomas felt a flush of anger rise in his neck. "Mrs. Bennett and her girls are managing fine at my farm. They're no burden." The conversation might have continued uncomfortably if Sheriff Davis hadn't chosen that moment to enter, stomping snow from his boots. "Miller, good to see you," he boomed, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Came to warn folks. Wolf pack's been spotted north of town. Keep your livestock close and your rifle closer." This news effectively diverted attention, allowing Thomas to help Sarah gather their supplies, while the townspeople questioned the sheriff about the wolves. They worked efficiently, selecting only necessities from Jenkins' shelves. Thomas noticed Sarah lingering briefly over a bolt of blue calico before moving on to practical items: flour, sugar, coffee. As Thomas paid for their goods, he added the blue fabric to their purchases without comment, ignoring Sarah's startled look. "The girls need new dresses for spring," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. Outside, they loaded their supplies into the sleigh. Thomas felt eyes watching from every window along the street. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Sarah finally spoke. "You shouldn't have bought that fabric," she said quietly, ensuring the girls were preoccupied with watching for wildlife. "I can't repay you yet. Consider it an advance on wages," Thomas replied. "Besides, Emma's growing out of everything she owns." Sarah studied his profile. "Is it always like that in town?" All those questions and judgments barely hidden behind smiles. Thomas sighed, guiding the horses around a snow-filled ditch. "Small towns run on two things: hard work and gossip. By tomorrow, there'll be a dozen different stories about why you're staying at my farm. None of them will match the simple truth. Which is that sometimes people help each other without seeking anything in return." The simplicity of his answer seemed to satisfy Sarah, who fell silent again, her gaze fixed on the horizon where Thomas's farmhouse gradually came into view. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Thomas found Sarah at the kitchen table, already cutting patterns from the blue calico. "I wanted to thank you," she said without looking up, "for defending us today." Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "Nothing to defend. You're honest people in honest circumstances." "Still," Sarah insisted, setting down her scissors, "few men would have done what you did, first taking us in, then standing against the town's judgment. Her gratitude made Thomas more uncomfortable than the town's suspicion had. "I've never much cared what Riversbend thinks of me." Sarah smiled slightly. "I noticed. Is that why you live so far out?" "No," Thomas answered, surprising himself with his honesty. "Elizabeth and I chose this place together. She loved the view from the East Hill, said she could see forever on clear days." "You must miss her terribly." Thomas nodded, unable to find words for the emptiness that had defined his existence these past 3 years. Yet somehow, the ache seemed different now, still present but less consuming, as if sharing it had lightened its weight. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "I think she would be disappointed in what I've become without her. A man who barely talks to his neighbors, who lets dust gather on her favorite books." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. "Grief changes us in ways we don't expect. After James died, I found myself unable to sing, something I'd done every day of my life before. The girls noticed. One night Emma asked if my voice had died in the mine alongside her father. The raw honesty of her words created a moment of connection between them, a recognition of shared experience that needed no further explanation. The following days established a new rhythm at the farm. Sarah insisted the girls continue their education, setting up a small schoolroom at the kitchen table each morning. Thomas found himself listening to Emma's reading lessons while repairing harnesses or cleaning tools, occasionally correcting a difficult word from across the room. One afternoon, a week after their trip to town, Thomas returned from checking fence lines to find Sarah teaching Emma to knead bread dough. Jane sat nearby, solemnly mimicking their movements with a small lump of her own. "Like this, Mama?" Emma asked, her face and apron dusted with flour. "Perfect," Sarah praised. "Now we let it rise while we prepare supper." Thomas paused in the doorway, struck by the domestic scene. For a moment, he could almost imagine this was his family, that he belonged in this picture of simple happiness rather than standing at its edges, a temporary guardian of borrowed joy. The illusion shattered when Emma spotted him. "Mr. Thomas, I'm making bread. Real bread." "I see that," he replied, removing his snow-covered boots. "You'll be running this farm yourself before long." Emma beamed at the compliment while Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "We've been keeping busy. The rabbit's doing better too." Emma's named him Lucky. "Lucky indeed," Thomas agreed, hanging his coat by the door. "Sheriff Davis mentioned wolves in the area. I've reinforced the barn doors, but it might be wise to keep the animals close for a while." Sarah nodded, her expression turning serious. "I thought I heard howling last night. Will they come near the house?" "Unlikely," Thomas assured her. "Wolves generally fear humans. Still, I'll keep the rifle loaded until they move on." That night, distant howls echoed across the snow-covered fields, sending chills down Thomas's spine despite his reassurances to Sarah. He checked the locks twice before retiring, positioning his rifle within easy reach beside his bed. Hours later, a crash jolted him awake. Not the howl of wolves, but the sound of breaking glass. Thomas grabbed his rifle and hurried downstairs in his nightclothes, heart pounding. In the kitchen, he found Sarah already there, lamp held high, surveying a broken window. "Something came through it," she whispered, pointing to shards of glass scattered across the floor and a small rock resting beneath the table. Thomas retrieved the stone, finding a paper wrapped around it, secured with string. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the crude message. "No decent woman stays with a man not her husband. Leave or face judgment." Sarah's sharp intake of breath told him she'd read the words over his shoulder. Her face paled in the lamplight, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "The town has made its opinion known." Thomas crumpled the paper in his fist, anger burning through his veins. "This isn't the town. Just some coward hiding in the dark." Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Emma's arrival, her sleep-tousled head appearing around the doorframe. "Mama? Mr. Thomas? I heard a noise." "Just the wind breaking a window," Sarah lied smoothly. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Everything's fine." But as Thomas nailed a board over the broken pane, he knew everything wasn't fine. The safety they'd built together these past weeks suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. The quiet life they'd been weaving had attracted attention, the kind that rarely led to good outcomes in isolated communities. "Perhaps we should reconsider Helena," Sarah said softly when Emma had returned upstairs. "I can't bring trouble to your door after all you've done for us." Thomas turned to face her, suddenly certain of one thing amidst all this uncertainty. "This is your home for as long as you choose. I won't have some anonymous threat drive you away." "But your reputation is my own to risk," he interrupted. "The only opinions that matter to me are in this house." Sarah studied him in the dim light, seeming to search for something in his expression. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, for she nodded slowly. "Very well," she agreed. "But if there's further trouble—" "There won't be," Thomas stated with more confidence than he felt. "Whoever did this got it out of their system. By spring, the gossip will find a new target." Yet as he secured the board over the window, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of vandalism was just the beginning, that something fundamental had shifted in their quiet existence, and the consequences were only starting to unfold. The rock through the window marked only the beginning. February gave way to March, bringing longer days and slowly warming temperatures that turned pristine snow into muddy slush. But as the natural world softened, the human one seemed to harden around the unusual household at Miller Farm. "Mail for you, Miller," Jenkins called from behind the general store counter, his tone deliberately casual as Thomas entered alone. "And some interesting talk going around town about your house guests." Thomas accepted the envelope without comment, recognizing the handwriting of his cousin from Ohio. News traveled slowly to the Montana territory, and family correspondence even slower. "Sheriff Davis was asking after you," Jenkins continued when Thomas didn't take his bait. "Seems someone reported seeing smoke from burning furniture coming from your property last week. People wondered if everything was all right out there." Thomas counted out coins for his purchases, keeping his expression neutral. "My business remains my own, Jenkins. But you can tell the sheriff I'm simply doing spring cleaning like everyone else." The half-truth sat uncomfortably on his tongue. He had indeed burned furniture, Elizabeth's dressing table, damaged beyond repair by the second rock thrown through their bedroom window. He'd found it shattered one morning, glass strewn across the floor like evil seeds. The attached note had contained words so vile he'd burned it alongside the broken furniture, not wanting Sarah or the girls to ever see such hatred. Course, Jenkins nodded, leaning closer. "Just concerned is all. Folks wonder about that Bennett woman's character, moving in with a widower so quick after her husband's passing." Thomas's hand tightened around his purchases. "Mrs. Bennett is employed as my housekeeper, nothing more. And any man who suggests otherwise to my face will answer for it." The storekeeper retreated a step at Thomas's quiet fury. "No offense meant. Just passing along what's being said." Outside, Thomas loaded his supplies into the wagon with sharp, angry movements. This visit to town had been strategic. Coming alone had been Sarah's suggestion after Emma returned from their last trip in tears, having overheard cruel whispers from the minister's wife about her mother. As he climbed onto the wagon seat, a woman's voice called his name. Thomas turned to see Mrs. Whitaker approaching, her perpetual expression of disapproval firmly in place. "Mr. Miller, a word if you please," she demanded, not waiting for his agreement. "The Ladies' Aid Society has discussed the unfortunate situation at your farm and reached a decision. We're prepared to find suitable lodging in town for Mrs. Bennett and her children, and arrange proper employment for her at the new hotel. This arrangement would be far more appropriate than her current position." Thomas regarded the woman coldly. "There is no situation at my farm, Mrs. Whitaker, and Mrs. Bennett already has suitable employment." "Mr. Miller," she persisted, lowering her voice, "consider your standing in the community. Consider poor Elizabeth's memory. What would she think of this scandalous arrangement?" The mention of his wife's name in this context ignited something dangerous in Thomas's chest. Elizabeth, he said quietly, would be ashamed of this town's behavior toward a widow and her children. Good day, Mrs. Whitaker. He flicked the reins before she could respond, the wagon lurching forward and leaving her sputtering indignation in his wake. His hands trembled with suppressed rage as he guided the horses toward home, his mind churning with the town's judgment and his own increasing uncertainty about the future. From her vantage point on the east hill behind the farm, Sarah watched Thomas's wagon approach along the muddy road. She'd come here to think, to sort through the tangled emotions the past weeks had created. This hillside had become her refuge, the place Elizabeth had loved for its expansive views. Sometimes Sarah spoke to her silently, woman to woman, asking impossible questions of the ghost whose presence still filled every corner of Thomas's life. "What would you have me do?" she whispered now, watching Thomas's rigid posture as he drove the wagon into the yard below. "They're destroying him because of us." The wind provided no answers, merely tugging at her shawl as she made her way down the hillside, careful of the slippery spring mud. As she approached the house, she could hear Emma's laughter mixed with Thomas's deeper voice. He'd brought peppermint sticks, a rare treat that had delighted the girls despite his obviously troubled mood. "You shouldn't have," Sarah said from the doorway, watching her daughter's happiness with bittersweet pleasure. Thomas looked up, something unreadable flickering across his face. Small things matter. After the girls were in bed, Thomas retreated to his workshop, seeking solace in routine. The rocking chair he'd begun for Elizabeth stood nearly complete now, a project resumed after years of neglect. His hands moved mechanically over the wood, sanding rough edges into smooth curves, while his mind wrestled with more complicated problems. Sarah's quiet entrance barely registered until she spoke. "The talk in town is getting worse, isn't it?" Thomas didn't look up. "Nothing worth repeating." "I heard what Emma told Jane," Sarah persisted. "About the minister's wife calling me a fallen woman. About the names the chandler's boy called them." Now Thomas did raise his head, his expression pained. "Children can be cruel when they parrot their parents' prejudice. It's not just cruel words anymore." Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "The broken windows, the dead rabbit left on our doorstep, these aren't childish pranks. Someone truly hates that we're here." Thomas set down his tools, finally meeting her gaze directly. "What would you have me do? Send you away because of ignorant gossip?" "Maybe the gossips aren't entirely wrong," Sarah said quietly. "We've created something that looks like a family, acts like a family. The lines have blurred, Thomas, whether we admit it or not." The truth of her words hung between them, uncomfortable but undeniable. Over the past weeks, they'd fallen into domestic patterns that felt increasingly natural, sharing meals, discussing the children's education, planning for spring planting. Thomas had begun teaching Emma to ride the gentlest mare, while Jane followed him around the farm like a small shadow. They'd created a life together that mimicked a family bond in every way except one. "I never intended," Thomas began. "Nor did I," Sarah interrupted gently. "But intentions matter less than reality. And the reality is that we've put you in an impossible position in this community." Thomas pushed away from his workbench, frustration evident in every line of his body. "This community has no right to judge what they don't understand. But they do judge, and their judgment has consequences." Sarah stepped closer, her expression resolute. "I received a letter today. My cousin in Helena finally responded. She's offered us a place to stay until I can find suitable work." The announcement hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "As soon as the mountain passes clear. It's for the best, Thomas. You know it is." He wanted to argue, to convince her that facing down the town's hostility together was preferable to returning to separate lives of loneliness. But the words wouldn't come, not when her decision was clearly made, not when her reasoning made such painful sense. "What will you tell the girls?" he asked instead. "The truth, that we've imposed on your kindness long enough. That Helena offers opportunities Silver Creek didn't." Thomas nodded, his throat tight with unspoken objections. "I suppose I'll hitch the wagon when you're ready." Thomas. Sarah moved closer, placing a hand tentatively on his arm. These months have meant more than I can say. You saved us when we had nowhere to turn. The girls adore you. And I them, he admitted roughly. The unspoken sentiment. And you hung between them, too dangerous to acknowledge. Sarah withdrew her hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I should finish packing. She turned to leave, but Thomas's voice stopped her. The rocking chair. I want you to take it. For the girls. Sarah glanced at the nearly completed chair, understanding its significance. I couldn't possibly. Please, Thomas insisted. It was meant for a family. It should have one. Later, alone in his workshop, Thomas ran his hand over the chair's smooth armrest, remembering Elizabeth's delight when he'd first described his plans to build it. For our babies, she'd said, eyes shining with hope. Now it would cradle another woman's children, far away in Helena where he couldn't see them grow. Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing away the last patches of dirty snow and coaxing new green life from the sleeping earth. Thomas watched water stream down the workshop window, distorting the world beyond into unrecognizable shapes. In a week, perhaps two, the mountain passes would clear enough for travel. And then the brief, unexpected chapter of his life would close, returning him to the solitude he'd thought he'd grown accustomed to. Only now, having glimpsed another possibility, Thomas wasn't sure he could bear it. You can't leave. Emma's voice cracked with emotion. Her small hands balled into fists. Mr. Thomas needs us. His cow just had a baby and Lucky still needs medicine and… Emma. Sarah knelt before her daughter, gently taking those clenched fists into her own hands. Mr. Thomas managed his farm long before we arrived. He'll continue to do fine without us. But he smiles now, the child insisted. He didn't smile before. Jane told me so. Sarah glanced at her younger daughter, surprised. Jane rarely spoke about her observations, though she missed little. When did Jane tell you this? Yesterday. Emma's lower lip trembled. She said his eyes were sad when we came, but now they're happy. If we go away, they'll be sad again. From the doorway, Thomas cleared his throat, alerting them to his presence. The saddlebags in his hands suggested he'd been preparing for a journey. Sheriff Davis stopped by, he announced, carefully avoiding the tension he'd walked into. Said the pass to Helena should be clear enough for travel by week's end. Sarah straightened, brushing wrinkles from her skirt. That's good news. Is it? Emma challenged, tears spilling down her cheeks. Why can't we stay forever? Why do grown-ups always ruin everything? She bolted from the room before either adult could respond, her footsteps pounding up the stairs. Jane remained seated at the kitchen table, her solemn eyes moving between her mother and Thomas. I need to check on her, Sarah sighed, moving toward the stairs. Let me try, Thomas suggested quietly. She might listen to a different voice right now. Surprised, Sarah nodded her permission. As Thomas disappeared upstairs, she settled beside Jane, smoothing her daughter's dark hair. What do you think about going to Helena? She asked gently. Jane considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Is Thomas coming too? No, sweetheart. Thomas needs to stay here and take care of his farm. Then I don't want to go, Jane stated simply. Thomas is our family now. The words stabbed at Sarah's heart, confirming what she'd feared. The girls had formed attachments that would make their inevitable departure even more painful. Thomas has been very kind to us, she explained carefully. But we aren't really his family. We need to make our own way. Jane's expression suggested she found adult logic deeply flawed, but she returned to her drawing without further argument. Upstairs, Thomas knocked softly on Emma's door. May I come in? Silence answered him, but he entered anyway, finding Emma face down on her bed, shoulders shaking with sobs. He sat awkwardly on the edge of the mattress, unsure how to comfort her. I built this house, he began conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Cut every timber, raised every wall with help from neighbors. Elizabeth designed it all. She had a good eye for such things. Wanted big windows facing east to catch the morning light. Emma's crying quieted slightly as she listened. When she died, this house felt too big, too empty. I considered leaving, finding somewhere smaller, but couldn't bear to abandon what we'd built together. Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. Then one snowy night, I found 3 people sleeping in my barn, and suddenly, the house didn't feel too big anymore. Emma rolled over, her tear-stained face emerging from the pillow. Then why are you making us leave? Thomas sighed heavily. It's complicated, Emma. Sometimes adults have to make hard choices for reasons that might not make sense to children. That's what Mama said when Papa died, Emma replied accusingly. It didn't make sense then either. Thomas couldn't help a sad smile at her perception. Your mother is trying to do what's best for you and Jane. She's very brave that way. But what's best for you? Emma asked with disarming directness. Don't you need a family too? The question struck Thomas speechless. How could he explain to this child that sometimes what a person needed most was precisely what they couldn't have? I'll be fine, he assured her finally. And so will you and Jane. Your mother is strong, like you. You'll make a good life in Helena. Emma studied his face doubtfully. Promise you won't forget us? I could never forget you, Thomas replied truthfully. Not in 100 years. The conversation seemed to settle Emma somewhat, though her eyes remained troubled as Thomas left her room. In the hallway, he nearly collided with Sarah, who'd clearly been listening. Thank you, she murmured, her expression unreadable. Thomas nodded, suddenly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. I'll be riding into town tomorrow. Need to order some supplies before summer. Of course, Sarah replied, stepping aside to let him pass. That night, Thomas lay awake long after the house had fallen silent, his mind racing with possibilities and regrets. Emma's question echoed in his thoughts. Don't you need a family too? The answer was more complicated than he'd admitted. Before dawn, Thomas rose and dressed quietly, leaving a note on the kitchen table explaining his early departure for town. The truth was more complicated. He needed space to think. Clarity that seemed impossible in a house filled with reminders of what he stood to lose. In Riverspend, the early spring morning found few people about. Thomas tied his horse outside the telegraph office, intent on sending an inquiry about lumber prices to a sawmill in the next county. As he emerged, folding the receipt into his pocket, a familiar voice hailed him. Miller, got a minute? Sheriff Davis approached, his expression unusually grave. Heard the Bennett woman's heading to Helena soon. Thomas nodded curtly. News travels fast. Small towns, Davis shrugged. Listen, there's something you should know. Had a stranger through town yesterday asking questions about a widow with 2 girls. Said he was from Silver Creek Way. Thomas felt a chill despite the morning sun. What kind of questions? Whereabouts mainly. Whether anyone matching their description had passed through. Seemed mighty interested when Jenkins mentioned your farm. Davis studied Thomas carefully. Anything I should know about this situation, Miller? What did you tell him? Thomas asked, ignoring the question. Nothing definite, Davis assured him. Something about the fellow didn't sit right. But Riverspend ain't that big. Won't take much asking around before someone points him your way. Thomas's mind raced. Did he give a name? Called himself Bennett. Said he was looking for his wife and children. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. James Bennett died in a mine collapse last fall. Sarah received official notification. Davis raised an eyebrow. Bodies aren't always recovered in those accidents. And mining companies aren't known for careful record-keeping when it comes to casualties. You think he's really her husband? Thomas asked, the possibility sending his thoughts into turmoil. Can't say, Davis replied. But I thought you should know before he shows up at your door. If he does, I'd appreciate a message. Something doesn't feel right about his questions. Thomas thanked the sheriff and mounted his horse, urging the animal to a gallop as soon as they cleared town. The farm came into view faster than usual, his horse responding to his urgency. In the farmyard, he found Sarah hanging laundry, her hair escaping its usual tidy bun in the spring breeze. She looked up in surprise at his precipitous return. "Thomas? Is everything all right?" He dismounted quickly, scanning the yard for the girls. "Where are Emma and Jane?" "Gathering eggs in the henhouse," Sarah replied, her expression growing concerned. "Thomas, what's happened?" He led her away from the clothesline, lowering his voice. "A man's been asking about you in town. Says he's James Bennett, looking for his wife and children." Sarah's face drained of color, the wet sheet in her hands dropping forgotten to the ground. "That's impossible. James is dead. I identified his body myself." "Are you certain? Mining accidents can—" "I saw him," Sarah interrupted, her voice unsteady. "His face was damaged, but I knew my husband. The company gave me his personal effects. They paid the death benefit." Thomas studied her reaction carefully, seeing genuine shock rather than guilt or deception. Sheriff Davis said this man didn't seem right somehow. Could someone be impersonating James for some reason? Sarah gripped the fence post for support, her mind clearly racing. "The mine settlement. The company paid me $50. It wasn't much, but in Silver Creek." She trailed off, a new fear dawning in her eyes. There were rumors about men who preyed on mining widows, claiming to be long-lost relatives entitled to death benefits. "Do you still have the money?" Thomas asked. "Most of it," Sarah nodded. "I kept it sewn into the lining of my travel bag. For Helena." Thomas made a quick decision. "Get the girls. Pack only what you need. You'll stay at the Sanderson place." "The abandoned homestead? But it's barely standing. It's 3 miles west, hidden in that stand of cottonwoods. No one from town goes there. You'll be safe until we figure this out." Thomas was already moving toward the house. "I'll bring supplies after dark." Sarah caught his arm. "Thomas, if this man is dangerous." "I'll handle him," Thomas assured her, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But I need you and the girls away from here first." Within the hour, Sarah and her daughters were safely hidden at the dilapidated Sanderson cabin, with blankets, food, and strict instructions to remain inside. Thomas returned to the farm, his rifle cleaned and loaded, to wait for their visitor. He didn't wait long. Late afternoon brought the sound of an approaching horse, followed by a stranger's call from the yard. "Hello? Anyone home?" Thomas stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but visibly. "Can I help you?" The man who dismounted was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps 35, with a handsome face partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were too fine for a miner, his manner too confident for a man who'd survived a deadly accident. "Name's James Bennett," he announced, removing his hat. "I understand my wife and daughters might be staying here." "You're mistaken," Thomas replied evenly. "No one by that name here." The stranger's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's strange. Half the town says differently." He glanced around the yard, noting the fresh laundry still pinned to the line. "Looks like a woman's been keeping house. Mind if I look around? Just to satisfy myself." "I do mind," Thomas said, shifting his rifle slightly. "This is private property." Something dangerous flickered across the man's face before his pleasant expression returned. "Forgive me for being direct, Mr. Miller, but there's been a misunderstanding. Sarah is my wife. There was an accident, yes, but reports of my death were premature. I've been recovering in a hospital in Helena these many months." "If that's true," Thomas challenged, "why did the mining company pay death benefits? Why did they make her identify your body?" The man's smile tightened. "A tragic case of mistaken identity. Another poor soul wearing my coat." In the confusion after the collapse, he spread his hands in a gesture of inevitability. "But I have proof of my identity." He reached slowly into his coat, producing papers that he held out confidently. "Marriage certificate, bank documents, even a photograph of our wedding day. I'll need to speak with Sarah. Clear up this unfortunate situation." Thomas didn't move to take the offered papers. Something about this man's story didn't add up, yet he seemed remarkably well prepared. What if he was telling the truth? What if James Bennet had somehow survived? "She's not here," Thomas said finally. "Took the girls to visit relatives near Fort Benton last week." Disappointment flashed across the stranger's face, quickly mastered. "I see. When do you expect her return?" "Hard to say. Roads are still bad this time of year." The man returned his papers to his pocket, his friendly demeanor cooling. "I'll be staying at the hotel in Riversbend. Please inform Sarah of my arrival when she returns. I'm eager to reunite my family." As the stranger mounted his horse, he fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. "One more thing, Mr. Miller. I understand you've been very helpful to my wife and children. I appreciate your Christian charity, but they're my responsibility now." The implied threat hung in the air as he rode away. Thomas remained on the porch until the rider disappeared from view, then quickly entered the house, gathering additional supplies. Night was falling by the time he reached the Sanderson place, finding Sarah anxiously watching through a cracked window. "He came," Thomas confirmed before she could ask. "Claims to be James with papers to prove it. Says there was a mistake, that another man was wearing his coat in the mine." Sarah sank onto a rickety chair. "It's not possible. I knew my husband. His hands, his wedding ring, they were James's. Could someone have taken his papers before the collapse? His coat?" Sarah shook her head, clearly struggling with the implications. "James always carried our marriage certificate and bank book. Said it was safer with him than at our company house." Her eyes widened suddenly. "The photograph. Did he mention a wedding photograph?" Thomas nodded. "Said he had one as proof." "That's not possible," Sarah whispered. "Our only wedding photograph was destroyed in a kitchen fire 2 years ago. James always regretted we couldn't afford another." They looked at each other in the fading light, understanding dawning simultaneously. This man, whoever he was not James Bennet, and his interest in Sarah likely had nothing to do with family reunion. "The $50, Thomas realized. "That's what he's after. And he'll do anything to get it," Sarah added, her gaze moving fearfully to her sleeping daughters, "including claiming to be their father." Thomas's expression hardened with resolve. "He won't get near them. I promise you that." As darkness settled completely over the abandoned homestead, Thomas and Sarah sat side by side, planning their next move against a threat neither had anticipated. A dead man come back to life, carrying false papers and dangerous intentions. Beyond the cabin's walls, spring peepers began their evening chorus, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within. Dawn broke through cracks in the Sanderson cabin's weathered walls, painting strips of golden light across the dusty floor. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about the stranger claiming to be her husband. Who was he really? How had he obtained James's personal papers? And most troubling, what would he do when he discovered the deception? "Mama!" Emma's sleepy voice came from the corner where the girls had nestled beneath borrowed quilts. "Why are we hiding?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Thomas, who had spent the night in a chair by the door, rifle across his knees. They had agreed to shield the children from the full truth. "It's just for a little adventure," Sarah answered, forcing brightness into her voice. "Like camping, but with a roof." Emma's skeptical expression suggested she wasn't convinced, but hunger soon distracted her. As Sarah prepared a simple breakfast from the supplies Thomas had brought, she noticed Jane watching Thomas with unusual intensity. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah asked. Jane pointed at Thomas's face, whispering, "He's scared too." The child's perception startled them both. Before either adult could respond, hoofbeats approached outside, sending Thomas immediately to the window. He relaxed slightly upon recognizing Sheriff Davis's distinctive bay mare. Davis dismounted cautiously, eyes scanning the dilapidated homestead. "Miller? You in there?" Thomas opened the door, relief evident in his posture. "Sheriff, how'd you find us?" "Followed your tracks," Davis replied simply. "Not many folks visit the old Sanderson place these days." His gaze moved past Thomas to Sarah and the girls. "Ma'am, Thought you might want to know your husband has been asking pointed questions all over town, offering money for information about your whereabouts. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her throat. Did anyone tell him about this place? Not that I know of, Davis assured her. But Riverspend ain't good at keeping secrets. Won't be long before someone mentions the abandoned homestead as a possibility. Thomas stepped outside, lowering his voice. Sheriff, we believe this man is an imposter. Mrs. Bennett identified her husband's body after the mine collapse. She says the wedding photograph he claims to possess was actually destroyed years ago. Davis nodded thoughtfully. I telegraphed Silver Creek this morning. Their sheriff remembers the Bennett case. Says James Bennett was definitely among the deceased. Death certificate and everything. Then who is this man? Thomas demanded. Can't say for certain, Davis replied. But there's been reports of a confidence man working mining towns, targeting widows who received settlements. Goes by several names. Inside the cabin, Sarah listened to this confirmation of her fears while keeping the girls occupied with breakfast. The tiny space suddenly felt like a trap rather than a sanctuary. We need to leave, she told Thomas when he returned inside. If he finds us here, we're cornered. Thomas knelt to her level where she sat on a rickety chair. The sheriff's going to help us. Says there's a U.S. Marshal passing through Helena who can arrest this man for fraud. Just need to keep you and the girls safe until then. How long? 3 days, maybe 4. Sarah looked at her daughters, then back to Thomas. We can't stay here that long. The girls need proper shelter, clean water. Sheriff Davis, who had followed Thomas inside, cleared his throat. My sister has a place outside Riverspend. Remote enough to be safe, comfortable enough for the children. I could take you there today. Hope flickered briefly in Sarah's eyes before doubt extinguished it. What if he follows us? Tracks us there too? That's why you'll go with the sheriff, Thomas explained quietly. While I return to the farm. Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. You're going to be the bait. Thomas nodded, his expression resolute. If he thinks you've returned to the farm, he'll come looking. The sheriff can arrest him there for trespassing at minimum. Should be enough to hold him until the marshal arrives. It's too dangerous, Sarah protested. This man is desperate. There's no telling what he might do. I'll be fine, Thomas assured her, though his confidence rang hollow even to his own ears. It's you and the girls I'm worried about. Sheriff Davis tactfully stepped outside, giving them privacy to discuss the plan. In the silence that followed, Emma approached, her young face solemn. Is the bad man looking for us? She asked directly. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sweetheart. A man is pretending to be your father to try to take the money we saved for Helena. Emma's eyes widened. But Papa is in heaven. Yes, he is, Sarah confirmed gently. This man is telling lies. Emma considered this information with surprising composure. So we have to hide until the sheriff catches him? That's right, Thomas answered. You'll go with Sheriff Davis to a safe place while I stay at the farm. But then you'll be alone when the bad man comes. Emma protested, genuine fear crossing her features. Thomas managed a reassuring smile. I've handled troublemakers before. Besides, Rusty will warn me if anyone approaches. The mention of Thomas's loyal dog seemed to comfort Emma somewhat, though worry still clouded her expression. Jane, who had been silently observing the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. Can I give you something, Mr. Thomas? She asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas knelt to the child's level. What is it, Jane? The little girl solemnly removed a small object from her pocket. The wooden horse Thomas had carved for her months ago. She pressed it into his hand, her earnest eyes meeting his. For luck, she explained simply. So you come back to us. Thomas closed his fingers around the small carving, unexpectedly moved by the child's gesture. I promise. An hour later, Sarah and the girls were safely hidden in Sheriff Davis's sister's cabin, a cozy structure tucked into a stand of pines 10 miles from Riverspend. Thomas returned to his farm alone, the wooden horse secure in his pocket as he prepared for his unwelcome visitor. The farm seemed unnaturally quiet without Sarah and the children. Thomas moved through his evening chores mechanically, feeding animals and securing the barn. Inside the house, he deliberately left lamps burning to suggest multiple occupants, then positioned himself in the darkened parlor with his rifle, Rusty alert at his feet. Night fell, bringing with it a tense silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or distant coyote call. Hours passed. Thomas fought against drowsiness, determined to remain vigilant. Just past midnight, Rusty's ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Moments later, Thomas heard it too, the soft approach of hoofbeats, deliberately slowed to minimize noise. Then silence, suggesting the rider had dismounted at a distance. Thomas extinguished the parlor lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Through the window, he caught movement, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows, approaching the house with careful stealth. The figure paused at the porch steps, apparently listening for sounds from within. When the first floorboard creaked under the intruder's weight, Thomas knew his plan was working. The imposter had taken the bait. The imposter moved like a man familiar with breaking and entering, each step calculated to minimize noise. Through the darkness, Thomas tracked his progress across the porch, watched as he tested the front door and found it deliberately unlocked. Rusty's growl deepened as the door swung open, admitting a slice of moonlight and the silhouette of the man claiming to be James Bennett. Thomas remained motionless in his concealed position, finger resting lightly alongside his rifle's trigger guard. The sheriff's instructions had been clear: confront but don't shoot unless absolutely necessary. They needed this man alive to face justice. "Sarah?" The intruder called softly, his voice carrying false concern. "It's James. I've come to take you and the girls home." The stranger advanced further into the house, passing through the shaft of moonlight that briefly illuminated his features, handsome, calculating, and entirely focused on his objective. He carried something in his right hand that Thomas couldn't immediately identify. "Sarah, please. I know you're confused. The sheriff told me you've been staying here." His tone remained gentle, reasonable, the voice of a concerned husband rather than a predator tracking prey. Thomas had heard enough. He struck a match, lighting the lamp beside him in one swift movement. "She's not here, as I told you yesterday." The imposter spun toward the light, surprise quickly masked by a politician's smile. "Mr. Miller, you startled me." His eyes darted around the room, assessing exits, threats. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I'm desperate to find my family." "We both know they're not your family," Thomas replied steadily, standing with his rifle held across his body, present but not yet threatening. "Sheriff Davis telegraphed Silver Creek. James Bennett died in that mine collapse, just as his wife said." Something dangerous flickered across the stranger's face before his pleasant expression reasserted itself. "A misunderstanding, I assure you. Telegraph messages get garbled. Records are lost. And wedding photographs that burned in kitchen fires 2 years ago magically reappear?" Thomas challenged. The imposter's smile faltered momentarily. In the lamplight, Thomas could now see what the man held, a sizable hunting knife, partially concealed against his trouser leg. "Where is she?" the man demanded, his pretense of friendliness evaporating. "Where's the money?" Thomas adjusted his grip on the rifle. "Sheriff Davis will be here any minute. I suggest you leave now while you still can." The imposter laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. "Davis is handling a disturbance at the saloon. Won't be here for hours. Planned it that way." He took a step forward, blade now held openly. "Last chance. Where is Sarah Bennett?" "Far beyond your reach," Thomas answered truthfully. The imposter's face hardened with fury. "Do you have any idea what I've invested in finding that woman? 3 months tracking her from Silver Creek, bribing company officials for records, learning everything about James Bennett so I could become him. For $50? Thomas asked incredulously. "All this for such a small sum?" $50 is just the beginning," the man snarled. "There's more coming. The miners' union is pressuring the company for additional settlements. Could be hundreds for each widow. His lip curled in contempt. Though I wouldn't expect a dirt farmer to understand the value of real money. The insult barely registered with Thomas, who was more concerned with the man's increasingly agitated movements. Rusty sensed the tension, his growl becoming more pronounced as he positioned himself between Thomas and the intruder. That dog makes another sound. I'll gut him where he stands, the impostor threatened, brandishing his blade. Something in Thomas snapped at the threat to his loyal companion. In one fluid motion, he raised his rifle, no longer concerned with Sheriff Davis's instructions. Drop the knife. Now. Instead of complying, the impostor lunged forward with unexpected speed. Thomas fired, but the sudden movement threw off his aim. The bullet splintered with somewhere behind the attacker, who crashed into Thomas with the full force of his weight. They tumbled backward, the rifle trapped awkwardly between them. The impostor slashed wildly with his knife, catching Thomas's sleeve and slicing through to the flesh beneath. Pain flared along Thomas's forearm, but adrenaline kept him fighting. Rusty launched himself at the attacker, teeth sinking into the man's knife arm. The impostor howled in pain, momentarily distracted. Thomas seized the opportunity, driving his knee upward and throwing the man sideways. The knife clattered to the floor. Thomas scrambled after it, but the impostor recovered quickly, landing a heavy blow to Thomas's jaw that sent him reeling. Stars exploded across his vision as his head struck the corner of the hearth. Through blurred sight, he saw the impostor retrieve his knife, advancing toward him with murderous intent. Should have minded your own business, farmer. The man spat, raising the blade. A deafening shot rang out. The impostor froze mid-step, confusion crossing his features before he crumpled to the floor. Behind him stood Sarah, Thomas's spare shotgun clutched in shaking hands, its barrel still smoking. Sarah, Thomas gasped, struggling to his feet despite the room spinning around him. How? I couldn't let you face him alone, she answered, carefully lowering the shotgun. Her eyes never left the fallen man. Is he? Thomas knelt beside the motionless impostor, checking for signs of life. Wounded, not dead. You caught him in the shoulder. Relief washed over Sarah's face. Thank God. I've never shot anyone before. Her composure began to crack, delayed shock setting in. The girls are safe with Mrs. Davis. I told them I forgot something important at the farm. Thomas tore strips from his shirt to bind the impostor's wound and secure his hands, all while processing Sarah's unexpected return. You shouldn't have come back. It was too dangerous. I couldn't stay away knowing you were in danger because of us, Sarah replied simply. Not after everything you've done. Before Thomas could respond, hoofbeats approached outside, followed by Sheriff Davis's voice calling his name. Sarah opened the door, explaining the situation in rapid, breathless sentences while Davis surveyed the scene with professional efficiency. Looks like we caught ourselves the Silver Creek Widowmaker, Davis commented, examining the unconscious impostor. Marshal Kane's been hunting this snake for months, wanted in 3 territories. As the sheriff loaded their prisoner into his wagon, Sarah insisted on cleaning and bandaging Thomas's knife wound, her touch gentle despite her still trembling hands. You could have been killed, she said softly. So could you, Thomas countered. Their eyes met in the lamplight, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Words seemed inadequate for what they'd just experienced together, for what they'd almost lost. Sheriff Davis returned, interrupting the moment. Need to get this scoundrel to the jail before he wakes up proper. You two'll need to come by tomorrow to give statements. He paused, glancing between them curiously. Mighty brave thing you did, Mrs. Bennett, coming back here. Most folks would have stayed hidden. Some things are worth the risk, Sheriff, Sarah answered, her eyes still on Thomas. After Davis departed with his prisoner, silence settled over the farmhouse, not the empty silence of Thomas's solitary years, but something expectant, hopeful. I should return to the girls, Sarah said finally. They'll be worried. Thomas nodded, suddenly unsure of where they stood. The danger had passed, but the questions about their future remained unanswered. I'll hitch the wagon, he offered. As Thomas prepared the horses, Sarah gathered a few belongings from the house. When she emerged onto the porch, she carried something that made Thomas pause. The completed rocking chair he'd finished for Elizabeth. "I thought we might bring this," she said hesitantly. "Emma and Jane have grown attached to it." Thomas's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Of course. The ride to the Davis homestead passed mostly in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts. Only as the cabin came into view did Sarah speak again. "Thomas, about Helena. You don't need to decide anything tonight," he interrupted gently. "There's time now." Sarah nodded, but something in her expression suggested she'd already reached a conclusion. "Actually, I've been thinking. Helena is a long journey, and my cousin's situation is uncertain at best." Thomas waited, barely daring to hope. "The girls need stability," Sarah continued carefully. "A safe home, familiar faces." She took a deep breath. "If your offer still stands, about staying on as housekeeper." "It stands," Thomas confirmed, his heart pounding. But, Sarah echoed, suddenly uncertain. Thomas guided the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "But I'd like to offer something more, if you'll consider it." He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around Jane's wooden horse for courage. "Not as my housekeeper, Sarah. As my wife." Surprise flashed across Sarah's features, followed by something deeper, more complex. "Thomas, you don't need to. I'm not offering out of obligation," he assured her quickly. "These past months, you and the girls have brought life back to my home, to me. I never expected to find family again after Elizabeth. Never thought I'd want to." His voice roughened with emotion. "But I do. I want you to stay, not because you need a place, but because I need you there." Sarah's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "The town will talk." "Let them," Thomas replied. "We know the truth of who we are, what we've been through together." From inside the cabin, a child's face appeared at the window. Emma, watching anxiously for their return. Beside her, Jane's solemn gaze fixed on them, as if she somehow understood the significance of this moment. Sarah followed Thomas's gaze to her daughters, then looked back at him, decision crystallizing in her eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, Thomas Miller, I will marry you." Relief and joy flooded Thomas's features. He took her hand, feeling as though some vital piece of himself had finally been restored. "I promise to be a good father to them, Sarah. A good husband to you." "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You already are." As they approached the cabin together, Emma burst through the door, Jane close behind. "Mama, Mr. Thomas, you're back." Thomas knelt, gathering both girls into a gentle embrace despite his injured arm. "We're back," he confirmed. "All of us together." Over the children's heads, his eyes met Sarah's, filled with the promise of tomorrow. What had begun on a snowy winter night with desperate strangers seeking shelter had transformed into something neither could have imagined. A second chance at family, at love, at wholeness. Outside the cabin, spring stars scattered across the Montana sky, witnessing silently as four lives, once separate paths of loss and loneliness, merged into a single journey forward, together.